Tomáš is going to be addressing Is This a New Frontier of Empire? So, Tomáš.
Thanks all for coming. The Russian invasion of Ukraine marks a very dangerous turning point in world history. It has unleashed death and destruction onto the people in Ukraine, but it's also made the world a much more dangerous place. We are seeing the world being drawn into rival camps. The United States, Russia and China, each armed with nuclear weapons, confronting one another right across Eastern Europe into Asia. And for both sides within this confrontation in Ukraine, the ordinary people living under the horror of missiles, bombs and shells are but pawns in this game to divide and redivide the world. And the stakes are incredibly high. For Russian President Vladimir Putin, he needs to score a victory in Ukraine, not just to stamp his authority on the country, but to send a signal right across the near abroad, the former Soviet republics, that Russia is still able to dominate and assert its interests in what it calls its near abroad. You know, the missile slamming into the crowded shopping centre in Kremenchuk underlines the horrors that have been taking place. A long list of bombed out shopping centres, maternity hospitals and housing estates. And it shows the sort of reactionary nature of that invasion. But then for the United States and for President Joe Biden, this is an opportunity to build what he calls a new world order. And you can see it's not just about Ukraine for the United States. Already they're saying that off the back of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we need to think about Taiwan and China and ramping up military pressure in Southeast Asia. You know, the declaration from the NATO summit in Madrid is chilling. It talks of being a blueprint for a more competitive world and promises the biggest military build-up in Europe since the end of the Cold War. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg promised a more forward-deployed combat formations, more high-readiness forces, and more pre-positioned equipment. Biden has already pledged to pour arms into Eastern Europe. This will include a permanent headquarters for the US Fifth Army Corps in Poland, 5,000 more troops in Romania, and 2 F-35 squadrons in Britain. It will also see air defence equipment deployed in Italy and Germany, and the amount of naval destroyers going up from 4 to 6 in Spain. This comes off the back of already the US deploying, on top of the 100,000 troops that is already deployed in Europe, which has already increased by 20,000 since the beginning of the Russian invasion there. And beyond just the US, you're seeing its allies increasing the number of troops in high alert from 40,000 to 300,000. This is an incredibly dangerous situation, and the other thing that happened at the NATO summit is that both Finland and Sweden will be invited to join NATO. Traditionally neutral countries, and that was brought about by an utterly filthy deal with the Turkish regime. So what's our response to this horror? Well, the first thing is, we of course oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in Britain, Socialists, the anti-war movement, have been very clear in saying Russian troops out. However, saying no to war is not enough. We also have to say that NATO is not the solution, that NATO escalation, whether it comes in the form of sanctions, arms, is not the solution and will make the situation worse. Now, why is this second part of what we say important? I mean, first of all, there's a basic argument. If there's a fire, don't be an arsonist. NATO pouring more arms into the situation is going to pour petrol onto the fire. And all you have to do is look at the hypocrisy and the track record of NATO to question what its motivations really are. So, for instance, when a Russian bombs destroy a maternity hospital in Mariupol, that's a war crime, which of course it is. But when US forces did that in the first days of the invasion in Iraq, that was simply collateral damage on the way to the liberation of the country and handing out sweets and laptops to children. That is what the US, by the way, claimed during that time. They are for the right to self-determination for the people of Ukraine and the right to self-defense, but when it comes to the people of Palestine, nothing matters around their right to self-determination whatsoever. we are against the bombing of civilians unless it is British-made bombs dropped by a British-backed Air Force, Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And this isn't whataboutery. It's about showing what the record of that West is and saying they're not talking about intervention in Ukraine for the sake of democracy or self-determination or anything like this. This is about a clash of rival empires. Now, we don't just talk about NATO and are against NATO intervention because of the hypocrisy. Whilst that's important, I think, it's also about understanding the nature of this conflict. How do we characterize it? And the dominant arguments are, this is a battle between democracy and dictatorship. You see the liberal West confronting autocracies in the form of Putin's Russia or the Chinese regime, or that this is simply a war of imperialist aggression by Russia against Ukraine, and the West is just sort of standing on the sidelines supporting a smaller country. And I think both of these explanations are wrong. This is fundamentally an inter-imperialist conflict between US imperialism and Russian imperialism, which is tearing Ukraine apart. A conflict which began before February. And I think to understand how we got here, we need to look at two things. First of all, to ask what is imperialism? And second of all, to ask what are the major rivalries taking place within world imperialism today? And once we do that, we can see how this conflict is an inter-imperialist one. On the first point of imperialism, I think there's sort of two dominant views of what imperialism is. On the one hand, there's a sort of trans-historical understanding of imperialism. It's simply about stronger states dominating weaker ones. There have always been empires, of course. One of the first books that I was told to read by my father, who's a historian, was Herodotus' Histories, where he talks of the Archimedean Empire and so on. And of course, geopolitical rivalries between states have always existed. But under capitalism, a Marxist understanding of modern imperialism sees it as flowing from the capitalist system. Vladimir Lenin was the revolutionary, put forward this sort of analysis at the beginning of the First World War. And I don't mention Lenin for the sake of sort of genuflection. I think it's because Lenin actually offers some valuable insights still today about about why the world is divided between these huge capitalist powers. And writing at the beginning of the First World War, Lenin says that capitalism has grown into this world system of colonial oppression and of financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between the 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers armed to the teeth, America, Great Britain, and Japan, who are drawing the whole world into their war over the division of their spoils. And today it's not America, Japan and Great Britain. You can talk about the United States, China, Germany, Britain, France and Russia as being the major capitalist powers that drive imperialist conflict. How does this happen? Why does it flow from imperialism? Well, if you think about it, at the time Marx was writing, capitalism was made up of many hundreds of small firms competing for an unknown world market. However, as capitalism developed in the 19th century, you see what Marx called the concentration and centralization of capital. Firms swallow one another up. You see the growth of monopolies, of oligopolies, the spilling of capital across national boundaries, and the growth of a world capitalist system, and also a growing interdependence of state and capital. There's this myth under neoliberalism that the state is less important because we live in a globalized capitalist system. In fact, multinational corporations rely on the nation state to protect their interests and to fight for their interests abroad against other nation states and other capitals. And this is fundamentally what you see. And the reason that competition comes into this and why it's so important is, there was this argument to say, but because capitalism spreads across the world, that's less likely to lead to war. That's less likely to see a division and redivision of the world as we're seeing now over Ukraine, China, and so on. There was Thomas Friedman, is this sort of US liberal commentator who's spouting the usual nonsense about Ukraine, this is a fight between the liberal West and so on. You know, in the 1990s, he said we would see less war because you have a globalized capitalist system, and no country with a McDonald's in it would go to war against another country with a McDonald's in it, because that would be bad for McDonald's. Now, of course, shortly afterwards, you see the bombing of Yugoslavia and the return of war onto the European landmass. Why is that? And that's the second part of Lenin's argument. He said capitalism it develops unevenly across the world. You don't see an equal development of capitalism. It's divided between weaker and stronger ones, with states competing to get to the top of that world pecking order. And which countries at the top of that pecking order can change quite rapidly. So you see competition driving this sort of imperialist rivalry within the system. How does this relate to Ukraine? Well, Ukraine sits at a much bigger fault line of inter-imperialist rivalries. This fault line begins with the Baltic states in the north. It cuts down into Ukraine, which is a key state within this fault line, through Moldova, into the Caucasus, an oil-rich, energy-rich region crisscrossed by oil and gas pipelines, and then right into Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and so on. And tensions are rising right across this, this imperialist fault line. And you don't have to take my word for it. Colonel Alexander Vindman was the National Security Council's, US National Security Council's director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Russia between 2018 and 2020. Speaking in November 2021, Vindman praised US leaders for, quote, some recognition of Ukraine's strategic value to NATO, but he actually complained that it was well short of where we should be weighing Ukraine in terms of regional and geopolitical standing. Why was this? Well, Vindman argued this weight would, quote, enable US and Euro-Atlantic aspirations for competition with Russia, competition with China. So in other words, the US sees this as a strategic part of the world and needs to pour in those arms and wage that war, because it's not about Ukraine for them, it's about a much broader clash of empires that's taking place. And tensions are rising right across this fault line. Why is this? I think we have to look at the sort of longer-term strategy of US imperialism and the crisis of US imperialism during the last 20 years or so. You know, after the Second World War, the United States emerged as the world's strongest superpower. The Cold War was an inter-imperialist conflict between the United States and what we in the SWP would call the state capitalist Soviet Union. And the world was drawn into these rival camps. Within its camp, the United States sought to construct a liberal capitalist world order, not based on the old colonies of the European powers, but one based on free trade and free markets, where its multinational corporations could dominate through their mass production industries. NATO was one plank within this attempt to project its power across this world order. You know, it's not a defensive alliance. It's about stamping US authority within Europe. NATO's first Secretary General, the British officer Lord Ismay, said the point of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. In other words, for the US, it was about securing themselves as a European power, and for the old European imperialist powers, it was a way of clinging on to the coattails of a much stronger US imperialism after they were bankrupted in the Second World War. The US emerges out of the Cold War as the only superpower, partly because of that military competition, the burden of arms spending on the Soviet Union. You see it collapse. And in 1991, the US thinks that it can dictate to the rest of the world what will take place. You know, George Bush Sr., the first Bush, says that there's a new world order, and the principle upon which it will be run is what we say goes. In other words, we've defeated the Soviets. There is no other peer competitor as the US sees it, and therefore we will be able to assert our interests wherever that is. Of course, the reality was much more complicated than this. I'm not prone to quoting war criminals in meetings, apart from whenever I do a meeting on imperialism. Henry Kissinger, who's the man responsible for carpet bombing Cambodia and Vietnam in the 70s, said in the 1990s that the US is still in no better position to dictate the global agenda unilaterally than it was at the beginning of the Cold War. And he said this was because the US will face economic competition of a kind it has never experienced from rising powers, particularly China. So in other words, whilst the US was the world's strongest military superpower, it was facing growing competition across the world, particularly from China. In order to try and overcome this contradiction, the US sought to use its military might through a brute assertion of military force in order to overcome this economic decline. And in the 1990s, you see US interventions in Somalia, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, and then the real chance for the US comes to assert itself after 9/11. 9/11, again, it's not some sort of clash between democracy and backward Islamism. For the United States, this was an opportunity to stamp their authority right across the greater Middle East. Starting with Afghanistan. I mean, some within the US actually wanted to go straight for Iraq, but they went for Afghanistan first and then went for Iraq in 2003. And what was, I think, thinking about Iraq is important in terms of imperialism, what's going on today, because what was it? Yes, it was a war for oil, but it's important not to be crude about it. The United States, did not need the oil for itself. However, it needed control over this huge deposit and reserve of oil within the world economy, because that could signal to rising powers, its competitors such as China, that if you want to use this oil for your growth, it is dependent on our goodwill. Your growth is dependent on what we say. However, the US was utterly defeated in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Iraq marked a major geopolitical defeat. So rather than sending a signal to its competitors that it was still top dog within the world, it sends a signal that it is possible to go against the US wishes, not on a world basis, but at least on a regional basis, even if the White House and the Pentagon don't think that's a good idea. One such power was Russia, which saw that it could assert itself more. Now, Russia in the 1990s faced a huge social crisis. President Boris Yeltsin sought to bring about a transition from state capitalism to free market capitalism under the tutelage of the United States through brutal free market shock therapy. And there were many within the Russian ruling class that thought Russia could become a junior partner to the United States within global capitalism. However, this did not mean that the Russian state or the Russian ruling class relinquished their ambitions to dominate the near abroad, those countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. However, it faced a problem because the free market shock therapy made a small number of oligarchs, sort of politically connected businessmen, incredibly wealthy. But it also caused a social crisis. We're talking wages unpaid for months, the collapse of whole heating systems in parts of Russia, but also this crisis reaches far into the military-industrial complex that had been key to Soviet economy and to the Soviet military, and it's competing on a much weakened scale. And therefore, what Russia does is to foment a series of frozen conflicts, a series of ethnic conflicts in its near abroad. So you think of Transnistria in Moldova, you think in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, 170,000 dead, 1.5 million refugees in the 1990s. The key sort of battleground, though, is Chechnya. Now, when Chechnya declares independence in 1991, the Russia can't allow this to stand. It's quite an industrially developed part of the world, and also, if Chechnya would go, that would send a signal to other parts of the near abroad that they could also defy and challenge Russian imperialism and Russian dominance. They send in the tanks, and after 18 months, they are utterly humiliated at the hands of the Chechen resistance, but also an anti-war movement and and partly a working class movement at home. Yeltsin emerges out of this quite weakened, and there's a circling of the wagons. The United States, the IMF pour in loads of money to make sure he wins the '96 election, which he does, an amazing turnaround. But nonetheless, he's seen as a bit of an inept alcoholic by the end of it and is pushed aside. In comes Putin, who gains support of a series of very powerful oligarchs who see that the need for more central control of the state, so Russia can assert itself much more in the world. And he scores a victory in Chechnya, Putin does, with the support of the West, by the way. You know, Blair flew to Russia after the pummeling of Grozny by Putin and said that this was a guy fighting against terrorism, just like we were, quote-unquote, in Afghanistan. Madeleine Albright, the then US Secretary of State, who died, thankfully, recently, said, you know, Putin was a problem-solving patriot. This is how the West was sort of viewing him, because they thought, well, actually, we're not for national liberation movements like in Chechnya gaining independence. Through the combination of his victory in Chechnya and then the spike in the oil prices in the 2000s, the Russian state is in a much stronger position to assert its interests. Now, there was still some within the ruling class at that point, within Russia and also the US, who thought perhaps there could be some cooperation. Right? The outgoing President Clinton in the 2000s toyed with the idea of Russia joining NATO, but ultimately said, you know, we can't do that because the admission of another nuclear-armed power into this US-dominated alliance would have destabilized it. You know, if NATO is about US dominance in the world, you're not going to let another nuclear power into it. And you know, NATO had already been trying to muscle in on that near abroad. For example, the GUAM organization between Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova in '97 was a NATO-backed outfit to try and assert their interests there. So competition was already taking place. The key thing, I think, is then that the United States breaks its sort of verbal promise to the last Soviet president that it wouldn't expand NATO, right? And because it needs to expand NATO as part of this project of asserting its military might across the world in order to try and send a signal to China and other competitors. NATO expands in 1999 to the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania and Slovenia. And the key crunch point comes in 2008 with the Bucharest summit of NATO. And there's an argument that goes on within NATO about how should they admit Georgia and Ukraine. And there was an interesting piece in the New York Times where I think it was Fiona Miller, who was an advisor about NATO affairs to Bush and his Vice President Cheney at the time, said, look, this is a bad idea. Don't expand NATO into Georgia and Ukraine. Germany and France aren't really that hot on it because they rely on gas supplies. We're fighting this terrible war in Iraq, which is draining our resources. This is overreach. Cheney storms out of the meeting, saying, you don't believe in democracy. Then Bush says, don't worry, he's only yanking your chain, but I like to play it tough. In other words, he said, I want to assert myself against Russia, but also I want to expand NATO into Ukraine and Georgia to send a signal to the Germans and the French that you can't go it alone. Don't try and defy us like you did around Iraq. We're still top dog in Europe. And this is what NATO expansion is about. It's not about defending democracy against, some revanchist regime in Russia. It was all about that. After Georgia says that it wants to join, many ways a dry run for Ukraine. The Russian army steps into the separatist regions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, preventing Georgia from joining NATO. This is because, officially, unresolved territorial disputes, quote, are a barrier to NATO membership, apart from if you're the Turkish state, but that's another meeting. As well as this growing competition with NATO, you also see growing competition with the European Union, which is not some sort of, fluffy liberal institution. It's a major, it's a block of capital, it's a sort of wannabe imperialism competing in the world. And in 2014, Ian Bond, who was the British ambassador to Latvia, sort of laid out what the European Union's position on the near abroad was. And he said that he complains that Putin is, quote, trying to shut us out of an area that is just as much our backyard as his backyard. If somebody is competing with you, if they are thwarting things that you think are in your interests, you have to do more to try and protect your interests as you see them. In other words, again, European Union expansion into Eastern Europe and over Ukraine, not about democracy. This is about economic competition with Russia and also its rival Eurasian Customs Union that it was building. So this is all about inter-imperialist competition here. And this is fundamentally what the 2014 crisis in Ukraine was about. It wasn't about democracy and self-determination. It was about which rival economic bloc, which rival armed bloc Ukraine would become part of. By 2014, the Ukrainian state is facing a financial crisis. It is desperately wanting hard currency. The generally kind of pro-Russian President Yanukovych toys with both the European Union and Russia. Now, of course, the European Union says, we'll bail you out, but you've got to be part of our club. Russia says, we'll bail you out, but you've got to be part of our club, and you can't be with them either. So this rivalry is tearing the country apart. In the end, Yanukovych plumps for Russia and going with Russia. You see protests emerge are in favour of the European Union Association Agreement, but which are relatively small. But then brutal police repression, particularly by the Berkut, sees a mass movement which then has anger about corruption, about the oligarchs in general, force out Yanukovych. His party of the regions collapses and he flees to Russia. A new government comes in which is pro-EU, pro-Western. And seeing that Ukraine could pivot fully towards the West, Putin annexes Crimea and supports an insurgency in the Donbass, the so-called people's republics. They're not people's republics. These are sort of run by sort of very reactionary gangsters, essentially, with a greater Russia chauvinist ideology. This war sees a carnival of reaction, with both sides sort of pumping out a nasty nationalism in order to bolster their own sides within this conflict. You see a peace talks that known as the Minsk Agreements, but all these do is freeze this conflict, and they freeze all these ethnic divisions and nationalist divisions which are tearing Ukraine apart. And then this conflict then hots up again in February with the Russian invasion. Now, why did Russia invade? So I certainly didn't think that Russia was going to go for an all-out invasion. So why did I get it wrong, I suppose? And I think there's two reasons. One is Russia was still facing there was still competition between the West and Russia, despite the Minsk Agreements, despite this frozen conflict. And by the autumn of 2021, the US and the European Union were winning that tug of war with Russia. And Putin saw less and less an opportunity to try and exert an influence on Ukrainian politics to keep it out of the Western orbit. The second reason, then, is that within that near abroad, you have seen a number of impressive popular revolts, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, which challenged pro-Moscow leaders within those countries. And therefore, I think Putin also wanted to send a signal, not just to Ukraine, but right across the near abroad, that we are still able to dominate, that West is not going to muscle in on these, on what we consider to be our backyard. So then, what's the solution here then, I suppose, is the question in the time that I've got left. Now, we want Russian troops to get out of Ukraine. The question is always, how's that going to happen and who's going to do it? And there's one possibility that this happens through US and NATO force of arms. And this is the dominant argument, including on the left, that we just simply have to talk about solidarity with Ukraine, which we do stand in solidarity with ordinary Ukrainians facing that horror, but we just have to say that and see NATO arms go into that country. That will not lead to an end to war. NATO intervention, the drawing of the world into rival armed camps, is not the solution. And why is this? It's because, again, Ukraine sits at that centre of that fault line of inter-imperialist rivalries. If the US wins in this proxy war, it will think to itself, we can assert ourselves right across the world. All those frozen conflicts which exist in the near abroad could then light up very easily. Transnistria, in the Caucasus, and other places in the near abroad. And therefore, that's not an anti-imperialist or anti-war solution. The real solution lies, I think, with three things. First of all, it lies with an anti-war movement and opposition to Putin inside Russia. Now, I'm not here to bullshit people. The Russian anti-war movement has been repressed. But we can see historical precedents for how an anti-war movement could develop. During the First Chechen War, when Russia was humiliated, how did this happen? One, with the Chechen resistance, who bravely fought against the Russian army. It was also through the mothers of the conscripts who died within Russia, and a working class anger at the free market reforms that were being pushed through by Yeltsin. And in some parts, for instance, on some demonstrations, miners would march with signs saying, Yeltsin, killer of Chechens, killer of miners. And you can see how that precedent can happen. What's the possibility? Well, a lot of the places where the conscripts are currently dying are from some of the most socially deprived parts of Russia. Dagestan, for instance, has an unemployment rate of 15%. Russia, before the sanctions, etc., 5%. So you could see the potential for anger at ordinary Russians dying on the front line, for what, by the way, and anger against the sort of nasty kind of neoliberal nature of the Putin regime coming together. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm saying there is a precedent for that happening, and that would be a progressive way of building opposition to the war. In this country, it means we have to build an anti-war movement which stands in solidarity with people in Russia, but also refuses to be cajoled and bullied into dropping our opposition to NATO. You know, we cannot allow the kind of smears of saying you're pro-Putin if you're against NATO to take hold. You know, whether it's the sort of the right or whether it's sort of idiots on the left like Paul Mason. And that's important to say that we're against NATO, because when ordinary people in Russia march, Putin says, oh, you're just pro-Western, you're pro-NATO. And those activists need to be able to say, no, we're part of an international anti-war movement that stands against all imperialism. We're not pro-NATO, we're against the invasion and against all imperialism. And ultimately in Ukraine, the solution has to lie with a resistance that is not subordinated to the interests of NATO, and with a vision of a country emerging which is free from both imperial camps. What is Zelensky? Think about this. He's presented a sort of mixture of Nelson Mandela and Ho Chi Minh in the press. He said, my goal is to make Ukraine, after the war, a big Israel. What does this mean? One, it's an outpost of US empire within Eastern Europe. And second of all, it is a barrack society dominated by the military. You know, this is not some sort of liberal vision which he's fighting for here. This is not the solution within Ukraine itself. And also, the other element which I think is important is the idea that the war is causing massive reverberations right across the world economy, not just in the global north, but also in the global south, the spike in bread prices and so on. And you can see how those sort of things could fuel revolts which allow ordinary people to impose their own democratic solutions on the situation. Now, that's not me laying out a blueprint and saying this will happen tomorrow. I'm not saying it will happen, I'm saying that's what should happen. When Lenin, during the First World War, said we have to turn the imperialist war into a civil war against the boss's system, it too seemed quite abstract. You know, at the Kienfeld conference, which took place 100 years ago, there were fewer people than there are in this room today. But they said, no, we have to build opposition to war on a principled anti-imperialist basis where we oppose all imperialism, but the way to do that is we have to say the main enemy is at home and oppose our own ruling class. And wherever you are, if you're in Russia, the main enemy is at home with the Russian state. If you're in the West, the main enemy is also our own ruling class. Not because we're indifferent to all the other imperialist powers, but because we think that's the best way for us to build opposition to an imperialist system which continues to drive war after war. And the fault lines that are being drawn today between the West, between China and Russia are going to define politics for the coming decades. And therefore we need to have a clear anti-imperialist politics and an internationalist politics which doesn't subordinate working class interest to either side, either ruling class, but puts forward an independence and socialist solution.
Comrades and friends, this is the point where we open the meeting up to discussion and contributions. We particularly welcome anyone who doesn't agree. I mean, this is being debated widely in society. Well, we want the debate here at Marxism. If you just put up your hand, we're going to have a roving mic, and I would really encourage people who haven't been to Marxism before, or I will be prioritising people I don't know.
Yes, all right. So thank you so much for your speech, and I think all I can do is add to it by saying socialists and Marxists stand with ordinary Ukrainians. Right? They don't stand with the ruling class, they stand with ordinary Ukrainians. And standing with ordinary Ukrainians means providing ordinary support to ordinary Ukrainians. I've been to the Polish border a few times, and I can tell, I've witnessed people from all over the world providing that support in a very brave and courageous way. You have volunteers organizing grassroots organizations and movements, helping in whatever way they can. And it's not easy to organize something from the ground up. People are delivering supplies, they're delivering people, refugees from conflict areas, and ultimately they're supporting guerrilla resistance in the form of all kinds of equipment that may be necessary, radios, bulletproof vests, and the reality is quite stark, and the situation is quite helpless at times. And beyond that, the donations of ordinary people abroad, sending money to these grassroots organizations. Currently, Ukraine is in a state of martial law, meaning that the majority of refugees are women and children, and men are not allowed to leave the country. And the Ukrainian state is asking for more help from ordinary people, as are ordinary citizens, but ordinary citizens are very grateful of the support from the international community and kind of shocked in a way. Beyond that, Russian protesters, I totally agree with the point that Russian protesters themselves have to be very brave in opposition to the Russian state. And NATO escalation, in a sense, alienates them, terrifies them, and reaffirms Russian propaganda in an unhelpful way. The most vulnerable communities in the world, in Russia, the ethnic Russians, you mentioned those in Dagestan and Chechnya, but there's also worth noting the Buryats, right, and the Kalmyks, who are disproportionately affected by this conflict as conscripts being sent to Ukraine and dying in disproportionate numbers. I would just kind of appeal to everyone to continue their ongoing support for grassroots NGOs and individual people trying to help. And I've seen the fault lines throughout Europe, especially in places like Hungary and Bulgaria, where Russian disinformation is, yes, it's overwhelming. And I think in addition to this, pan-European solidarity within a socialist context is equally important and necessary. So thank you.
Okay.
Hi, yeah. So I just sort of kind of wanted to give some insight into what being in the opposition in Russia actually feels like. I'm Russian. I went to 3 protests right when the war started on the 24th and the following days. And after that, I fled the country, basically. I'm not a refugee or anything, but I did leave. And now I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. So basically, the opposition is extremely disoriented. It doesn't have a leader anymore. We had Navalny at some point, but now he's gone, obviously. He has been imprisoned. The Russian feminist anti-war movement is probably the strongest one. They have 27,000 people, and they are protesting in the in a very cool way. They basically go into supermarkets and they change the prices into the information about the war that the Russian government doesn't disclose. How the protest actually goes, on the 24th, 4,000 people went out to protest in Moscow. That's not a lot. But 1,600 of them were arrested. They were beaten up, it was just very, very scary. And the general feeling, the emotion that I felt throughout it was complete and utter disorientation. no one would tell you where to go. Basically, the only sense of direction, and I mean it in like in a literal and in a metaphorical sense, was to run away from the police. And I honestly don't know how to protest. I don't really have a clue, and I would be really grateful if like someone would come up with something in order for the Russians to be able to protest, because we have lost that right completely.
Yeah. Thank you very much. With the face masks standing up.
Yes, it's important to note, as your comrades have experienced, that these arguments are coming up all the time in our class. Okay, maybe it's not as dominating now as it was at the beginning of the war, but I went to one of the UCU strike pickets in early March. It seems a long time ago because it was winter. I'm not in that union, but I went to support and to bring along leaflets for one of the initial SWB meetings that we had in Manchester, no to war, no to NATO. And, you know, to say it provoked quite a discussion would be understating it. It was a very firm but fraternal discussion, but of course many people didn't necessarily agree, and said some of the strikers said that NATO was a voluntary alliance, saying we should keep the peace, etc., etc. We can't possibly be against it. So it's important to take those arguments up in a firm but fraternal way. But there's also, that one is not too difficult for all the reasons that Tomáš has said, but there's a slightly more difficult one, isn't there, that you may come across, which is that the Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves, and therefore, in their nation, if you like, sourcing arms from NATO or wherever, we mustn't stand in the way of that. We mustn't obstruct NATO and Western governments supplying arms because the people of Ukraine have demanded it. Well, leave aside for a moment that the resistance in Ukraine is a a militaristic capitalist state, again, as Tomáš was outlining. But there can be a contradiction. We do support the rise of a nationalist movement, which often emerges in the middle of imperialist battles, to defend themselves. Of course we do, and to get their weapons from wherever they get them, and good luck to them in the usage. I mean, come on, I'm sure I'm not the only anti-imperialist in the room who was quite pleased to see Russia saying we're exiting Snake Island. This is the little block of land where apparently Ukrainian forces initially told them to F off at the beginning of the war. So it's quite, come on, I'm not the only one taking a bit of pleasure in that. But if we fudge the argument over NATO, then we play straight into Putin's hands. We have to judge everything we do on the basis of whether it aids the Russian anti-war movement and the Russian movement against Putin from recovering and emerging again. We have to judge all our actions from their point of view, not simply from what's easy for us to say in a union meeting over there.
Okay, thank you. Can the microphone pass to the person with their hand up there?
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm wondering if you, Tomáš, if you would... Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I'm wondering, Tomáš, if you might agree, there's a lot of condescension in the West towards Russia, that they're brainwashed by propaganda, but we have propaganda in the West. I mean, the Iraq War was arguably one of the greatest atrocities of the 21st century. It was brought upon by falsified evidence, and I feel that there's a blind spot in the West about this, and I guess my two main questions for you are, if you have comments on these. There's been a huge outcry from intellectuals in the global South about the hypocrisy of Western Europe's sudden compassion for Ukrainian refugees when they didn't have compassion for all the refugees from Libya, from Syria in 2015, 2016. Vijay Prashad and he's a professor at Trinity College, and Joseph Massad, professor of Arab politics at Columbia, New York. They all talk about how it's this idea that those countries, Iraq, Libya, Syria, they're inherently violent. So of course it's not a big tragedy when people have to flee. But a Western country with people with blonde hair and blue eyes, and in fact a Ukrainian deputy prosecutor, David Saakashvili, he's actually caught on camera saying this to BBC in an interview. He said, I'm really upset about the Ukraine war because for the first time the people fleeing their country have blonde hair and blue eyes. You can Google it, it's on Twitter, Sakvarladze, David Saakashvili. Okay, and my second question is just, I'm wondering what you think, if you have any thoughts about, I don't know if you're familiar with Oliver Stone's film Ukraine on Fire, where he talks about the long history of neo-Nazis within Ukraine and, you know, making Stepan Bandera a national hero. And it's very hard to assess the validity of these claims. I mean, each side says, one side says you're exaggerating, the other says you're minimizing. And I'm curious what your take on that about, you know, all the whole shebang, you know, Azov Battalion and neo-Nazis, and how serious is that? And can we completely dismiss Putin's claims that he wants to denazify Donbass? Those are my two questions.
Right, brilliant. I'm trying to order, and then the woman next to you will be on.
Hi, yeah, thank you. The comrade speaker, when he was talking about the reasons for the war, I think he left out the fact that there was an existential threat as far as Russia was concerned, because what actually triggered the war, the immediate antecedent to the war, was Ukraine's insistence that they wanted to join NATO, and that would have brought nuclear weapons onto the doorsteps of Russia. And I think that was because previous to that, for several weeks, Russian troops had been amassing on the borders. There were several large troop movements. I mean, if the West or the Ukrainian authorities had wanted to stop war, then, I mean, Russia itself said that if Ukraine gave up its insistence on joining NATO, then there would be no war. So I think that was the immediate antecedent to the war. I mean, if Ukraine hadn't insisted on joining NATO, I don't think there would have been war. I mean, the war had been rumbling for years. I mean, but I think that was actually what triggered it. And somebody previously was talking about Western media propaganda. I mean, what happened initially when hostilities started was Britain banned Russia Today. I mean, that just sent a signal that there was going to be mass censorship of the media as far as the Russia war was concerned. And then they started putting out stories that Putin was mad, and lately he's got cancer. I mean, so you have all this Western propaganda going on, and I don't want to sound as if I'm pro-Putin, but what I've seen from the left is that they want to satisfy the middle classes, because of course what's happening in Ukraine is wrong, but at the end of the day we have to condemn the West because they are using the Ukrainians as pawns. We have to condemn the West and condemn NATO. And finally,
bring your closing remark.
Yeah, closing remarks. I mean, I just wanted to say that at the risk of sounding pro-Putin, right, I think we should be harping on about the role of NATO as opposed to just supporting the Ukrainians. Everybody supports people who suffer in war. I mean, but we shouldn't be playing into the hands of the middle classes or the liberals. I mean, we should support the defeat of the imperialists, the Western imperialists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the speech, comrade. You mentioned an interesting example. You said about the hypocrisy that Western communities condemning the bombs falling in Ukraine, but didn't condemn enough the bombs falling in Iraq. It's just interesting that you have to reach that far from example, because for this conflict started 8 years ago. And I want to speak up and I want to request some compassion for the people of the Donbass, because for 8 years they were bombed, they were shelled, they were cut off, their pensions were cut off, the utilities were cut off. Poroshenko, the previous president of Ukraine, he actually went on stage and he said, our children, meaning in Western Ukraine, they'll go to school, but those children in Eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, they'll sit in basements and they'll suffer because those people are terrorists, they're dissidents, they're not embracing this nationalist idea of Ukraine. And on top of that, the government, even under Zelensky, the law passed under Poroshenko, but he passed it on to Zelensky, and Zelensky did not abort this law. A law that said that Russian is basically erased from the official public sphere, so you cannot study in university in Russian, you cannot hold public office if you want to speak Russian, courthouses. So the people who are in Eastern Ukraine, they're being disenfranchised, they're being bullied. Basically, it's a type of ethnic cleansing, because Ukraine has this nationalist idea. On the 1st of January, they celebrate Bandera Day, it's a national holiday. But there was a Nazi collaborator, and they're celebrating him. Because he was a nationalist. I mean, you cannot create a nation at the expense of bullying ethnic minorities, like the Russian Ukrainians in the east. So full disclosure, I'm half Kazakh, my father's Kazakh, I'm 1/4 Ukrainian, I'm 1/4 Russian. I have family on both sides of this conflict. This is very close to my heart. And I think that you're oversimplifying, you're completely cutting out the Donbass from the discussion, saying, oh, they're not people's republics, they're some kind of bandits and gangsters. Well, no, they've been suffering for such a long time. I encourage everyone to watch a documentary, first of all, by Alder. She was censored by the Figaro. Her article was removed, and she was removed from YouTube. There are still some videos up. She tries to explain the situation there, and there's also a documentary called Ukraine Heading East. It's about the people of Donbass, and they're saying they're not against Ukraine, but they've been so bullied by the government. They had no one else to turn to but Russia. So yes, and just one more thing, because British people especially should understand this, because there's an analogy between the situation in Donbass and the Northern Irish conflict. You don't have just the Catholics against the Irish Catholics against the English. You also have the Protestants. So you had multiple sides. You can't cut. It's a multi-party conflict. You have to speak about all the sides, and you have to speak especially about the neo-Nazi situation in Ukraine, because as someone who's
I'm going to have to ask you to come to a conclusion. Sorry, just because there's lots of... And then, Comrade, you're going to come down.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about why it's so important to oppose NATO expansion. And I'm an activist in my trade union, PCS, as a Public and Commercial Services Union, and I'm also a member of the National Executive Committee. We are the civil servants and government departments. And we raised a motion on Ukraine, and the motion condemned Russia, of course, and we said that we had to welcome all refugees from wherever, including Yemen and Palestine and wherever they come from. We had to support the anti-war movement in Russia, and we had to say no to NATO expansion. And we didn't win that argument. This was back in April, and we were told that our sloganising was defending Russia, but nevertheless, we persisted, and we raised the motion again in my branch, and we got an even bigger kicking then. And, there was it was really an echo of the Labour Party and Keir Starmer, and the idea that you could criticise NATO at all was, as I say, we lost the argument. But as socialists, we have to tell the truth. And that means we have to talk about what a disaster this is, and we have to tell the truth about NATO and imperialism, and we have to find ways to raise anti-war arguments and activities, because the trade union is a class organisation, and we are the organised working class, and we have to fight for our class, and that means fighting against nationalist chauvinism and imperialism, and if you don't win the argument first time, you make it again and again until you do. Thanks.
Just want to make one point about the Donbass quickly. I'm sure Tomáš will probably come back. All I would say here is that what we saw in terms of the civil war effectively in 14-15 in Ukraine was a consequence of the imperialist rivalry that tore Ukraine apart. It was not true that Russian-speaking ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, Ukrainian-speaking people in Ukraine were uniformly divided down a line from the independence of Ukraine onwards. These divisions were fermented and created, and it resulted in reactionary nationalism and ethnic division on all sides at the behest of the imperialist powers outside. I wanted to respond though to the Russian comrade at the back, because I think she painted a really graphic picture of just how difficult it is for the anti-war movement and anti-war activists in Russia. I speak to friends in Moscow who are anti-war every week. They have fallen completely silent, not because they're cowards, but they would risk their job, they would risk prison, they would risk the assaults and abuse from neighbours and so on. But however grim it seems, the importance of establishing a political current wherever we are, whether it's in Russia, in Ukraine, or here in Britain, in the UK, this is critical. And I want to say one thing about the Russian working class, because it is painted as either apathetic, passive, not interested in politics, or a kind of chauvinist mass cheering on the war. We should remember that when the Putin project started to falter economically, Russian workers came out into the streets in 2005 against the reforms and cuts in benefits. And Putin's polls didn't recover until actually the annexation of Crimea. But then 4 years later, they slumped from 80% down 20 points. Why? Because they were forced to try and introduce pension reforms that would have meant that 43% of the male population would never have seen retirement. Mass protests across the entirety of Russia. And we should remember too that it was the Russian working class in 1989 that dealt such a blow to the final days of the Soviet Empire and the Soviet Union. Now, I'll finish with this. It's not a click of the fingers to get that back, but the repression has a reason. They're terrified of the power. They're terrified of the potential power, not only in Russia, but across the nearer board. And we've got to turn the crisis they put onto us into the crisis for them, for their side.
Hi, my name's Roxanne. I'm a supporter of a group called the Bolshevik Tendency. I would echo some of the sentiments of the two comrades in the middle of the room there. Firstly, I'm going to quote 3 war criminals if I've got time. We'll see how it goes. Firstly, John McCain talked about Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country, which I think is quite a good pithy quote to demonstrate that even this bourgeois politician recognises that Russia is not imperialist. And that is where I would come from in terms of my position on the war as well, because I know the SWP defines Russia as imperialist, therefore it follows that you are dual defeatist. So obviously how we approach the question of imperialism is so vital, and it's situations like this war where it becomes apparent. I would, I guess, in this very short amount of time I have, give you the essence of where I come from with it by saying that my understanding of Lenin is that essentially a country needs to have a net inflow of surplus value across time, and Russia does not have that. An opposite example of how it operates, with John McCain's quote in mind, is that it actually subsidizes Ukraine massively, $10 to $15 billion every year in its main commodity of energy. That's not the act of an imperialist power that has leverage. That's why, of course, the actual imperialists are going after Russia. And lots of people empirically recognise that's what they're doing, the encirclement of Russia, or as Dick Cheney, my second war criminal, said, we're going to balkanise Russia, we're going to break it up, we're going to destroy it. And as Hillary Clinton said, we're going to turn Ukraine into another Afghanistan. They know what they're doing. And as the comrade in the middle said, no matter what you think about Russia, surely we have to at least recognise, even from their point of view, their right to defend themselves, without giving an ounce, as a revolutionary, of course, of political support to the Putin regime. And I know we have a whole spectrum because, you know, there's going to be some Stalinists who bend it way too far the other way. Point being, in this war, we're Russian defensists for the military victory against NATO. I welcome the chair saying we have difference in the room and we're going to debate it. and I put it to the speaker that this is the correct position to take in this war. I don't condone war crimes, but I think your incorrect categorization of Russia as an imperialist leads you to be on the wrong side of the barricades in this. And I will end by saying, when I've read your some stuff, for example, by your comrade in your theoretical journal about this, I'm confused by categories such as lesser imperialists and sub-imperialists. I think you've got it very wrong, comrades.
Right, thank you. And
two questions. I'm confronted in Germany with people who argue, yes, we are against NATO, but the people who are fighting in Ukraine should get weapons. And I think about the heavy weapons which are sent to Ukraine, very heavy weapons. Who is going to fight with these weapons? This is one point. And the second is, the second is the people in Ukraine, they have to defend the queer community, for example. Therefore, they need weapons. We have to support them. And the third thing is, what does self-defense now mean if we are talking about an inter-imperialist war? Isn't it now sort of anti-phrase?
okay, thank you. And I'm keeping people in groups. And the Polish, I know this comment from Poland.
Thanks. I'm a socialist from Poland. I've spent half my life in Britain and half in Poland, and I can't remember a time, maybe once in '62 when I was this high, when there was a real threat of nuclear war. And that's why, actually, it's one of the main reasons why it's important to analyse this whole thing from the perspective of a clash of imperialisms, because otherwise we can't understand anything. But of course, when people talk about this war, they often, when you talk about the inter-imperialist conflict, they say, yeah, but you don't care about your ordinary Ukrainians. You're just reflecting the imperialist strategy, like Brzezinski, one of the American strategists, called the world a great chessboard. And you're just reflecting that. You don't care about the small country like Ukraine. Well, actually we do, because I think a Guardian journalist recently put it very well. He said what the West is doing in Ukraine is actually leading to a slow strangulation of the Ukrainians. And that's exactly what's happened. The West is quite happy, actually, even if Ukraine doesn't join NATO, as long as the Russian side is weakened. And that's what their strategy is all about. Yesterday, the Polish president was all beaming, and the ministers were all happy because there's an American base, a permanent American base in Poland from now on. And they're saying that, you know, this is defending us, this is a defense for all Poles, so we should all rejoice. Most people actually do think that NATO is defending, but at the same time, the real hope is that at the same time people are worried that there's a real serious threat of war with Poland being involved directly in a war situation. And that can happen in this war. There's nothing that's off the table in the future because we have a clash of imperialism. I'll just wind up on this, that when we say that whether Ukraine has a democratic right to join NATO or not, we're against the NATO alliance as the biggest military alliance in the world. We don't want further wars led by NATO. Therefore, the question of whether somebody has a democratic right to join this horrible war machine, the biggest war machine in the world, is not a question of democracy, it's a question of dismantling the war machine. And that's the way we should put it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody can be but horrified at the destruction and death that has been brought to the Ukrainians. But I think that we also have to be very careful to look at exactly the sort of society that Zelensky is trying to build in the Ukraine. The truth is, you see, is that Zelensky, as brilliant a propagandist as he is actually backed by a multi-billionaire oligarch, his name was Kolomoisky, and he is a Zionist. Zelensky also has acquiesced in the banning of political parties inside the Ukraine. But as Thomas and others have pointed out, the most damning indictment of the argument that Ukraine is fighting for self-determination is the way in which Zelensky identifies with the racist, oppressive state of Israel and all the misery and destruction that brings not only to Palestinians but across the Middle East. And I think that we have to say a real movement of self-determination. We should look at Vietnam. Now, Vietnam was led by the Stalinist Ho Chi Minh, but he had a social program. First of all foreign troops out of Vietnam. What is Zelensky's attitude regarding that? Secondly, the Vietnamese called for redistribution of land and a change in the social structure of Vietnam. Zelensky wants to be an outpost of US imperialism and NATO. So it is absolutely right, it seems to me, to say that as well-intentioned as the self-determination argument is, it doesn't deal with the central question of the inter-imperialist rivalry of which the Ukrainians, led by Zelensky, are pawns in that game.
Thank you. Yeah, going there, going right there. Yes, their hand up, so, yeah. Okay, I think you will be our last contribution. Sorry to anyone.
I've got two questions. I've heard some circles describe the protests in 2014 as a coup, the Euromaidan coup. Just wanted to know what you thought of that. Oh, there's a mic. There we go. Secondly, what did you make of Zizek's article in The Guardian recently? That's it.
Okay.
Did you get that?
Yep. Okay, all right. Apologies to others who put their hands up. Sorry, people were very disciplined with time. I'm going to now give Tomáš will have 10 minutes. Oh, there's a thing. Thomas will have 10 minutes to come back on those issues. Do you know how to use it?
No, sorry.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
Sorry. It's difficult when you...
Is that working?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, I want to make 2 points. The first is on imperialism. For those of us who are Marxists, imperialism is a global system of competing capitalist states where geopolitical and economic rivalries combine. And it's driven forward by those rivalries between the big capitalist powers. And today those are the US, China, Germany and Russia. Okay? I don't think one can just look at what Lenin says and say, not everything lines up to the tick box within his pamphlet Imperialism. He called his pamphlet a popular outline. A lot of the precise economic analysis from the time just doesn't stack up anymore. What we can take from it is that basic kernel which says this is about competition, right? And that's what we have to do. Lenin also said that to be an imperialist country you had to be a net exporter of capital. The United States has been a net importer of capital, so by that measure you shouldn't think that the US is imperialist. It's nonsense. So that's the first thing. And within this global system, there are no defensive powers. There was someone who said, I don't want to sound like a supporter of Putin, and they made a bloody good job of it. Russia is not a defensive power reacting to it. Yes, it is responding to competition because it wants to assert its interests in the near abroad to dominate the countries surrounding it. Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus, because it wants to keep those countries weak in the same way that the United States wants to dominate other countries around the world, and therefore this is a clash of empires. There are no defensive powers in this side, and therefore you shouldn't subordinate yourself either to going along with Russian interests or to going along with saying, the United States is some sort of progressive force, or NATO is some sort of progressive force within all of this. On the left, we always face the test of war. What is our attitude to it? And vast parts of the left have utterly failed that test. You look at the Labour left, first day they run up the white flag of surrender. They can't even put their names on a statement because it mentioned NATO, for Christ's sake. These people are cowards. And are behaving in exactly the same way to the Social Democrats in the First World War, who failed that test as well. So whilst we're a minority today who argue against both the Russian invasion and against NATO as being a solution, having that position is incredibly important, because it means we are opposed to all the imperialist powers, but we also understand the need to take our own ruling class on within that system. So therefore, I think that's the correct position. Russian troops out, no to NATO escalation and expansion. If you're taking an anti-imperialist and internationalist position on this. Second point I want to make is about some of the questions around Ukraine. Look, Ukraine gained independence in 1991. We in the SWP were quite unique on the left in supporting the collapse of the Soviet Union. We did not think that was a bad thing in world history, we thought it was a good thing. The Russian Revolution was a genuine working class revolution, but under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a state capitalist country that exploited working class people and competed militarily and economically with the West. And what led to that breakup was partly those military pressures, but also revolts by working class people in the Eastern Bloc and within the Soviet Union itself. And what forged the basis for a great support for independence within Ukraine, both East and West, across those sort of ethnic divides, was actually a strong element of working class struggle. When miners in the Donbass struck, miners in the west of Ukraine also struck as well. However, Ukraine was severely affected by the free market shock therapy. It was a relatively, had a capitalist ruling class, but a relatively weak one, and concentrated around groups of oligarchs, in one group in Donbass, the other in Dnipropetrovsk. Now, if you're an oligarch, you have a problem, right? You can't just turn around to voters and say, I want to asset strip the economy, I want to make you poorer, and therefore vote for me, and some of them were more pro-Russian, some of them were pro-Western. So what you've got to do is you've got to build a social base around some sort of ideology. And this is what rival oligarchs have done. Some through appealing to greater Russian chauvinism, others to a very reactionary Ukrainian nationalism. But what's important to emphasize is these were not the views of the majority of ordinary people. You've got to be carefully taught, right? In order to instill these sort of divisions. Between 2003 and 2010, the percentage of young people in Ukraine using only Ukrainian or only Russian drops. Bilingualism, 19% in 2003, 40% in 2010. By 2009, the number of Ukrainians who saw ethnic divisions as a problem fell from 50% to 37%. However, as the financial crisis hits in 2008 and the ruling class has to rely on dividing ordinary people, this soars to 73% by 2014. And therefore, it's not some sort of natural division in people's heads, between sort of West and Eastern Ukraine. These divisions were pushed. Russia has used them in the Donbass through greater Russian chauvinism. The idea that these are genuine people's republics. There's a certain section of the British left hears the term People's Republic, they sort of go a bit weak at the knees, right? But, for instance, Igor Girkin, who was the first defense minister, this guy was of the Donetsk People's Republic, was involved in the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. If you think this is left-wing in some way, it's completely wild, I'm afraid to say. And in the West, then, the ruling class there did rehabilitate figures who, Bandera and so on, who were anti-Semitic, who were on the far right, and who did fight with the Nazis in the Second World War. And that's how this sort of carnival of reaction then forms. And then after the protests in 2014, you see this escalation and this entrenchment of that sort of division. Now, just on 2014 itself, it wasn't a coup. Right? You saw genuine anger on the streets. You saw protests in favour of an EU association agreement. But then when you look at the polls as to why people came out in large numbers, police repression. After the cops step in, corruption and so on. The problem is that there wasn't any force there putting forward an independent solution, saying the real solution to get rid of the oligarchs and so on doesn't lie with either going towards the Russian camp or towards the Western camp. It lies with a vision of a country free from these divisions where ordinary people have a say. And there wasn't a force that did that, and therefore that popular anger got pushed into a pro-Western direction. And therefore it couldn't have become a all nationwide movement, precisely because it was latched onto saying the solution to our problems is going with the West. I remember I went to Ukraine with Rob actually in, I think, 2015 on the anniversary of the Maidan, and we were interviewing people. I was interviewing people there, and they said, what do you think about the situation of the country under Poroshenko? And they'd say, it's terrible, the oligarchs still have all the power, no one pays their taxes, but that's because we should use that tax money to fund the army. And people in the east of the country are terrorists and mentally ill. And that's not, you could see how in any other part of the world, those people, those young students might have been involved in the Fees revolt back then, or the Indignados or whatever, but because of that kind of nationalist division, backed up by competing imperialisms, the country has been torn apart in that way. And therefore, the solution doesn't lie with going with either imperialist power. It has to lie with putting forward an independent and working class alternative. And that can seem very difficult. And I'm not, as I said before, I'm not here to bullshit people about it's going to happen. But there are historical examples. In 1913, marked 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia. There was a huge popular demonstration in favour of the Romanovs. People died. Do you know why they died? Because they were trying to touch the Tsar because they thought he was living God. Right? A few years later, those same men and women made the revolution that opened the door to human liberation. Ideas can change. It is possible for even the darkest days of repression for things to switch. But that does require, I think, us as revolutionary socialists to be organised and to put forward a position which doesn't subordinate our interests to the state, to the rival imperialist powers. So the solution does not lie with the West. It does not lie with some defensivist war by Russia or whatever the hell that was. It lies with us building a movement here which can stand in solidarity with ordinary Russians, but also oppose our own ruling class, and also raise the question of what drives this division and redivision of the world. It comes from a capitalist system, and therefore we have to actually build opposition to that as well. And I'll just finish on this. During the Cold War, the front page of Socialist Worker said neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. And we're still fighting for that today. We're not going along with any of these imperialist powers. And if you agree with that sort of position, I think you should be part of that fight and join us.